us here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly.
Wow.
In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano. We're broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Today, we are pleased and honored to have Ryan McMaken. He's the editor of Mises Daily and the Austrian as our guest. He has degrees in economics and political science from the University of Colorado and was the economist for the Colorado Division of Housing from 2009 to 2014. He is the author of Commie Cowboys, the Bourgeoisie, and the Nation State in Western genre. We'd like you to listen in, please, and, of course, call in with your questions or comments, 646-652-4620. If you dial 1, we'll know that you want to break in and ask a question or make a comment. We look forward to hearing from you. Ryan, thank you so much for oh, by the way, I want to add also that we lost the video, so we're going to sacrifice everyone. You'll have to be looking at me during the broadcast. We are unable to connect with our guest, so you'll hear our guest, but you'll be seeing me. I'm not Ryan, he's looking for that reason. But Ryan, thank you so much for being on our program.
Hello, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Ryan, the breadth of your knowledge is incredible. I've read several of your articles. They are logical and whatever. And I know you've written an article recently, and it was called, No, the Military Has No... no, I'm sorry. Woman in the Military. I want to get to the other one later on. Women in the military. Now, right now, there've always been women in the military. There's back in the old days, there was the wax and the waves and stuff like that. Of course, one time I mentioned that many years ago, and a gal almost punched me in the nose. But they haven't been in combat. When you say women in the military, are you referring to women in combat or women serving in support roles to combat troops?
Oh, well, my position is I don't care one way or the other as long as it's voluntary. So if women want to be in the military, if they want to do what the U.S. does in combat nowadays, which is mostly bomb weddings and, flatten cities that are no threat to the U.S. whatsoever, well, then they can participate in that if they want. But just my problem is that a few weeks ago they were talking about drafting women into the military. And drafting people is a horrible idea. So I simply wrote up a column saying that drafting women is a terrible idea. And that if we're concerned about equality, the answer is not to draft women too, but to stop drafting men.
Right. Now, we're not drafting men right now. Now it's still a voluntary army, is it not?
Well, yes. The article where you read really talks about the selective service, of course. Right. We have an unused draft at the moment. They're all ready to go with it if they need to. They've got your names, they've got your address, and so that's what selective service is there for, so that they can draft you if they feel like it. And so the discussion was about adding women to the selective service, and I'm, of course, very opposed to that.
Well, in your article that I've read recently, you talk about how drafting people in the military is sort of an involuntary tax. You're taxing people because you're using their labor, to perform a government function that they may not even want to do, but they're in the military and they must obey, or they get thrown in the brink.
Sure. It is a 100% tax on what you do with yourself for the duration. So if you are drafted and you are forced into a job that you don't even want, it's a 24-hour day sort of thing in most cases, and everything you do all day is taken by the government for their benefit. Yeah, you're allowed a little bit of free time here and there, but pretty much you're a slave for the period that that you have been drafted.
Yeah, I don't want to get religious or philosophical or whatever. Our politicians are always bringing up one religion or another, and and how righteous we are as a country and whatever. And one of the precepts of every religion that at least I'm familiar with is "Thou shalt not kill." Now you can protect yourself, but "Thou shalt not kill" is sort of a standard, with it across the board, with whether it be the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. You just don't go around killing people because you like to do that, because you favor doing that. over doing something else. And yet, I've always took the position that you have a young man that's graduated high school, maybe has few skills, thinks he can go into the military and learn computer skills or electronics or whatever, mechanics. And so he joins the military, and we teach them how to kill. That's what we do. We teach them how to kill. Then we take them, transport them 7,000 miles away or wherever, right? And then they're given instructions saying, you see that bunker there, or you see that town, or you see that house, or whatever, kill everyone in there, complete your mission. We make killers out of them. How do we morally justify, of course, the reason why we're doing that, because they're a threat to us, and we have a war on terror, and we have declared them terrorists, although they have not been convicted of being a terrorist, we kill them anyway. And in many cases, and I've seen videos of this, actual videos of young women and with their children killed in courtyards because the soldiers were told to complete their mission. Most of these soldiers come back and have severe psychological problems. Now, am I overstating that? Am I just reaching too far?
No, I don't think you'd have any trouble coming up with many examples of horrible atrocities committed during war. I think maybe why the U.S. is in this debate right now about whether military action is justified is because most of it takes place in such faraway places against alleged enemies who have never been shown to actually be a threat to the U.S. A perfect case is the invasion of Iraq. I mean, we're now talking about Saudi Arabia being the primary impetus between 9/11. But weren't we being told 10 years ago that it was all Iraq's fault, that Iraq caused 9/11?
That's right.
And I haven't seen the statistics lately, but I know up until several years ago, a third of Americans still believed that Iraq had something to do with 9/11, which you just have to be completely ignorant to think that. There's never been any data whatsoever showing any connection between Iraq and 9/11. So now what's the justification for the invasion of Iraq? Oh, Saddam was a bad guy, as if the death squads that currently go across Iraq today murdering people and destroying ancient Christianity in those places is somehow better than Saddam Hussein, where under Saddam you could be a Christian, you could purchase alcohol, you could lead a moderately normal life under this military strongman, whereas today you can live under ISIS, or under the death squads in southern Iraq. So excellent idea that the U.S. accomplished there. So that's why we're debating this sort of thing, is so much of it has so little to do with any obvious impending threat. I think most people would admit, yes, if people are landing on your shores with guns and they're trying to invade, or they're setting off bombs in your cities, then that's the sort of thing that has to be defended against. But you don't actually defend against people setting off bombs in your cities with standing armies. Invading foreign countries doesn't actually solve that problem. And invading countries that had nothing to do with any attacks on your soil, like Iraq, solves no problems. And so if women want to participate in that sort of thing, that has nothing to do with actual defense of North America, then I suppose that's a decision they can make. But I certainly don't want any women who want nothing to do with that to be forced into doing that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, I'm against the draft, 100%. I'm against having really an army per se. In my demented mind, and at my age it's demented, because I'm too old to be undemented, I guess. But it seems that the way a country should run is that everyone in that country is in the military. Men, women, children, everyone's in the military, but not formally, informally. Just like Switzerland, everyone has to own a rifle or a gun, to protect the homeland. If someone should invade us, we should have the National Guard, and the National Guard is your formal militia in each state. And should someone attack us, which is very unlikely unless the Canadians are going to come down and invade us, and the Mexicans, which they just want to come here and work, work that we don't want to do. But if they would come here, and of course technologically and militarily we're so superior to everyone else, no one would dare doing that, we would have the wherewithal to protect ourselves. All right, that is protecting oneself. What we do is there is no such thing as war on terror. Obviously, you have this war on this concept. We're war on a concept, and yet we take innocent men and women, we kill them on their soil, invade them, and then we want to know why we have a problem with terrorism. Well, aren't we the ones that are creating the terrorism? If we left everyone alone and mind our own business and had free trade with everyone, would this world be a better place, or am I just a simpleton getting too old and I should retire?
Well, it would probably reduce the problem. I think you're always going to have some people who are motivated to kill neighbors or people who are a perceived threat, even if they're not an actual threat. But that's why we would have a militia. That's why there would be a defensive police force, a defensive military force, and so on. And, of course, the U.S. Used to have this. It was a decentralized military force. And we've actually covered this a little bit at Mises.org, which is where I do all this writing, MISES.org. And there was an interesting little history within our scholarly journal that was written about 20 years ago. And it looks at, unfortunately, there's very little history actually written on this topic, but it looks at the history of the militias in the U.S. And they were actually, it was the private decentralized militias that were the most effective. The official U.S. Army was extremely small and was actually not particularly good at dealing with border wars and other issues that were fairly common in the U.S. of the 19th century. And so what was used then to prevent or to protect settlements from, say, Indian raids or raids from pirates and things like that were private groups like privateers, who were essentially like pirate good guys, if you will, and also locally based militias. Many of them were very well armed for the technology of the time and were fairly effective. They had better record in battle than the official army in many cases. And so this is why the Second Amendment mentions a militia and why a well-trained militia is essential and all of that. It was this idea that most of the people in a society would have at least some skill with military defense and would be called upon if necessary. Now, this goes back also to the Netherlands and to the Low Countries in Europe, where there were these decentralized, locally based military forces. Now, you might say, oh, well, in a world of nuclear weapons and so on, that doesn't work. Well, there are already nuclear weapons, and the U.S. already has lots of them, much more so than anybody else. And that's a completely separate issue from, you can't proceed logically from that, in that, well, nuclear missiles exist, therefore we should send armies to go invade Iraq. This is a diversionary tactic that people who are in favor of lots of military intervention like to use. Is in reality, most safety issues, most military defense issues need to be done in a decentralized and localized way, because attacking quote-unquote America is a nonsense phrase, right? Either a certain city is attacked, a place is attacked. We don't live in America. We live in cities and particular places. And so you need a strategy that addresses that issue. And so to then say, well, there are threats out there and people hate us, therefore we should invade countries that are no threat to the U.S. whatsoever. They're just trying to muddy the waters by coming up with, well, there are threats out there, therefore whatever the U.S. military does should be supported and justified. You can see the complete lack of logic that is employed in that case. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that military action is never justified, that there is no reason to ever kill in self-defense and so on. However, I recognize that there is a huge, huge gap between recognizing that threats exist and then claiming you need this gigantic standing army that can be sent around the world to invade foreign countries every couple of years. And those two issues are so simply unrelated. Never mind the fact that the U.S. has an enormous Navy and Air Force, which makes North America completely impenetrable in terms of invasion and so on. Nobody's going to be invading North America. It's just not going to happen. You're delusional if you think that Iraq is going to send its Navy, which doesn't exist, of course, to go invade North America. So you don't need an army sitting around to defend against that. And but if you point out these things, then they immediately start bringing up red herrings and claiming that you're some kind of pacifist or something like that. So once you get into these issues, you have to doggedly stick to specifics, because once you start talking about these vague generalities and imagined threats, the bad guys end up winning that debate because they know that people recognize on an instinctive level that the world would not be completely at peace if you just disarmed. However, most of what the U.S. uses its army for example, is just to occupy foreign countries and really has nothing to do with defense of North America.
Well, I have a hypothesis or a philosophy or whatever you want to call it. Every year there's I forgot which city, which country in the Middle East it is, where there's the National Arms Show, where every country comes and displays the latest in armament so they can sell to other nations. And of course, the United States is there, and we're selling arms to everyone, And I often thought that when Iran wanted to build have nuclear capabilities, I thought, what a stupid thing to try to stop them. Why don't we supply them with the parts? I mean, if anything, if it breaks down, they have to come to us and say, by the way, this doohickey broke, we need another one. I mean, they wouldn't attack us if we helped them build up their own nuclear capability, since most people do anyway. I mean, wouldn't we be better off by taking all our troops out of all of the countries, closing all of the bases? Everyone comes home, minds their own business. If a country wants to do something, why don't we just supply them? And it shouldn't be the government, it should be any country here in the United States, company rather, in the United States that wants to supply them. Free trade with them. What country would want to attack us because we free trade and help them achieve their goals? It may be I'm a simpleton, but I could never understand the United States strategy. To me, it's counterproductive. Am I ready for the nursing home?
Well, of course, the Iranian government convinces the Iranian people that the U.S. is an evil in the world because the U.S. had supported a number of coups in Iran, and generally had come down on the side of various Western powers to assert control and ownership of oil fields in Iran and to generally meddle in their local affairs on a repeated basis. So that's the only reason anybody even finds it plausible in Iran that the U.S. is horrible. And, of course, there's a significant underground in Iran of people who oppose the regime there. If they couldn't, of course, point to many very real examples of U.S. meddling in Iran, then they simply wouldn't be able to convince their people that the U.S. was something worth hating. Now, of course, point to me all of the times that Iran actually has attacked the United States in recent decades, and I believe the number is 0, certainly 0 on American soil. It could have been that there were some military actions taken against U.S. soldiers who were in foreign countries that were in no threat to the United States. And so, sure, yeah, what's the problem there? There's an additional issue here, which is, of course, proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, we did carry an article on this on Mises.org. And while it's just assumed by everybody who's not familiar with the national defense literature on this, with the international relations literature, that's just assumed, oh, yeah, well, everybody's against proliferation of nuclear arms. That's not actually true. There's actually significant debate among international relations scholars and tacticians as to whether nuclear proliferation actually leads to a greater likelihood of conflict or a lower likelihood of conflict. Now, Walt Mearsheimer, who's a long-time and well-respected international relations scholar, takes the position that no, it's not necessarily true that opposing proliferation of nuclear weapons is most likely to produce a more peaceful world. And we can look at multiple examples of this historically. Even though the U.S. tried to prevent it from happening, India and Pakistan got nuclear weapons. And so far, no nuclear war there. And so far, of course, China, after the U.S. and the Soviet Union got nuclear weapons, they got nuclear weapons. France, contrary to what NATO wanted, went out on their own and got their own nuclear weapons. Israel has their own and did that against what the international community wanted. Now, of course, the U.S. always supports whatever Israel's doing, so nobody ever talks about that nuclear proliferation. And so there's been actually quite a bit of proliferation since the 1950s. And the only nuclear wars that almost happened were between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right.
It was on at least 3 different occasions, the U.S. and the Soviet Union almost started nuclear wars with each other. And so, according to Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense, it was just pure luck that we haven't destroyed the world. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Clearly, nuclear weapons are very dangerous. However, by reducing their proliferation, you're actually really just creating two huge nuclear blocks that are more likely to destroy the whole planet than creating a situation where we might have a local nuclear war. It would be much, much better for the planet Earth if India and Pakistan had a limited nuclear war than if the U.S. and the Soviet Union had a nuclear war, because the range of attack would be much, much larger. Never mind the fact that the U.S. and the Soviet Union have, of course, thousands of missiles, whereas all the other countries have, like, at most a couple of hundred.
Yeah.
And so really the anti-proliferation movement just simply ensures that you've got mega states with thousands of missiles basically lording that over the rest of the planet. And it also just encourages more war in general, because we've noticed that the U.S. has never invaded a country that actually has nuclear missiles. It always selects dirt-poor third world countries that have no ability to fight back and have no nuclear weapons of their own. This is why the U.S. will not be invading North Korea anytime soon, because North Korea, as limited as their nuclear capability is, might be able to deliver a nuke to Seoul, and the U.S. isn't willing to take that risk. Well, you hope that's true. I'm sure that the South Koreans hope the U.S. isn't willing to take that risk. And so the lack of proliferation actually has empowered the megastates with nuclear weapons to simply be more belligerent and to enter into military situations that are more likely to lead to some mistake happening and actually leading to a full-scale nuclear war. I mean, it's not beyond the pale of possibility that the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or in the Soviet Union, that U.S. and Russia could end up in a nuclear war over the Ukraine or some issue in Central Europe or in Central Asia or in Eastern Europe. I mean, this isn't like something we should just assume could never happen. And so we should really be opposing any sort of military action by the U.S. and expanding NATO or just generally causing trouble for the Russians, and really looking after its own self in terms of defense in North America and just expanding its friendly relations with a variety of countries. And it's just like, as you say, what's wrong with being friendly with Iran or some country like that? I mean, what's laughable, of course, is that the U.S. is best friends forever with Saudi Arabia, which is the most brutal dictatorship on earth, probably. I mean, they cut off people's heads every day for, like, ridiculous non-crimes like sorcery and witchcraft. It's just one of the worst places in the world. And the Bush family is close friends with those horrible dictators. Remember when Bush walked around hand in hand with the king of Saudi Arabia about 12 years ago? I mean, it's just so ridiculous that we're told that Saudi Arabia is great, but Iran, those people are zealots.
They don't allow women to drive in Saudi Arabia, or they didn't. I'm not sure if they've changed that policy at all. But
if you try to sneak in a bottle of vodka, you'll probably be killed. If you read the Bible, you'll be arrested. I mean, it's just one of the worst places on
they
earth.
don't kill you. They just behead you. That's a difference, you know.
And so as long as the United States is friends and allies with Saudi Arabia, then you should just regard everything they say as ridiculous and just utterly without logic.
Yeah. Well, there's several things that bother me on many levels, but whenever the neocons here in America talk about, the war on terror or about a particular country, they never mention the fact that we're the ones that were responsible for Saddam Hussein. We supported Saddam Hussein in the 7-year war with Iran, where about every young man eventually was killed. They had kids on the front lines killing each other, and no one understood why we were doing that. It made no sense, but yet we were the kingpin in that war. But the politicians never ask, why is Iran so hostile to the United States? Well, it's logical if you understand history. None of these politicians that are running for office ever explain why the situation is what it is. It's like today's the first day of the world, and the first, there was no history before today. Here's a comment, we go forward. And none of what they say, if you understand or you study history, makes any sense whatsoever. And I can't even listen to these debates, because when they say that the greatest threat to America, is ISIS, I go nuts. I mean, I'm already there, but I go further nuts, if you will. And my response, I don't say it out loud, in my head says, no, our greatest threat to America is our own government and the way people think or have been taught to think. What's your comment about that?
Well, I don't know how you can justify an idea that ISIS is the greatest threat to Americans, given the distance and their incapability of actually pulling off any sort of real military attack. It's assumed, of course, because people have watched too many movies, that ISIS is going to get a suitcase bomb and set it off in lower Manhattan. But that's not really a threat. Oh, and my favorite, of course, I mean, it's just amazing what people are willing to believe. For example, recent claims that terrorists will use drones to drop dirty bombs on people. The problem, of course, being that in order to construct a dirty bomb that actually has the ability to spread radiation to a wide, just to a wide audience, if you will, wide victim circle, it's very, very heavy, and you need like thousands of pounds of radioactive material. So no, there won't be any little drones doing that. But people really believe anything because they saw a movie about how terrorists are able to put a giant bomb in their pocket and kill 1,000 people. But if you look at, of course, the regularity, the fatality numbers on terrorist attacks in recent years, they're just simply tiny. There's no threat there compared to how the U.S. Was in the 19th century or even in the 20th century. Even the military will just come right out and say, America's never been safer in terms of, look, with the Navy and the Air Force and the intelligence, there's nothing going on there. It's mostly politicians, and oddly, it is often, in fact, the military that will somewhat oppose the administration when it's the administration that wants a new war. I mean, it was even the CIA, which I'm no fan of, basically came out and said there's no justification for invading Iraq if you're going to try and connect it to 9/11. But the Bush administration said, nope, too bad, we're going to go ahead with it anyway. And so they manufactured a case for that. And so it's the politicians often who are actually even more aggressive than the military special interests in these cases.
And I guess the sorrowful part is that the American people generally believe that. They hear it over and over again, and if you ask the man on the street, if you will, a question in that regard, you get word for word what you've heard on television without giving any thought to it whatsoever. And today's nuclear weapons are hundreds, maybe thousands of times more powerful than the bombs that we released on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so these small countries, if you threw one large nuclear bomb in some of these countries, I mean, it would cover the entire country. You wouldn't have to throw a second one. Everyone would be dead, and that country would be lifeless for probably centuries. I mean, none of that makes any sense that this is the way we're going to solve our problems, because there's a good chance if you drop a bomb in one country, you're going to radiate half the people in the adjacent country that's our ally. I mean, I can go on for an hour on this thing because none of it makes sense, but these politicians have a knack of making it make sense, and we actually believe it, and it really bothers me, and we seem to be going down the wrong path.
Well, and of course, proliferation can be shown to actually reduce the likelihood of conflict. It empowers small states against large states, actually makes a decentralized political order more possible by allowing military defense for even small states who might be next to a neighboring state. For example, Mearsheimer noted that it was actually a terrible mistake for the Ukraine to get rid of its nuclear arms, because after the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine had numerous nuclear weapons within its territory. And Mearsheimer was opposed to them giving that up. pointing out that if Ukraine had just kept them, that would have actually contributed to stability in the region, because it would have prevented a later resurgent Russia from attempting to take over the Ukraine.
Right.
Of course, it would have also prevented the U.S. from attempting to take over the Ukraine.
Right.
So the U.S. was all in favor of decommissioning the nukes in the Ukraine. And so, we'd all be better off if there had been proliferation throughout Eastern Europe. I mean, look at Poland. Poland stands no chance of opposing the Russians, assuming, this all assumes that the Russians want to invade Poland or something, which I don't think is true. But just to be on the safe side, if you're the Poles, you should have your own stockpile, just to ensure that never happens.
That's right. Yeah.
And so we can see how proliferation actually ends up providing stability. And of course, the states themselves have every motivation to make sure that those nukes don't get stolen or taken over by terrorists, because of course they can then be used by the status quo power who's in control there. So there's no reason also believe that just nukes would suddenly be running around the world being traded and handed off to all sorts of different groups either. And in fact, that didn't even happen when the Soviet Union fell, which was kind of a worst case scenario in terms of control over nuclear materials, politically speaking. Because if your state collapses, what happens to all those nuclear materials? Nobody even knew actually who was in control of many of those after the fall in 1990. And fortunately, it turns out that getting nukes and passing them around is actually more difficult than you think it is. And so much of this is just based on Hollywood fear-mongering, and nobody's really thinking through the actual history that has taken place. The far more dangerous scenario has been having two megastates with 1,000 missiles that can destroy the whole planet.
Right. Well, I forgot who said this. We have met the enemy, and it is us. I forgot who coined that phrase, and that's. I repeat that to myself. Someday I'm going to look it up, see who said that, so I sound intelligent for once in my life. But by the way, we have already taken up 30 minutes of your time, and that's all you had allotted for us. We appreciate that very much. I'd like to give you the last minute of our program. Maybe you can tell our listeners about your book and any other information, contact information, or any other comments you want to make.
Well, I just want to note that for most everything we've discussed here today has been written and analyzed to some extent at the Mises Institute's website, which is mises.org. And foreign policy really is not our main focus, but certainly we try to look at, take a realistic look at new ways of looking at foreign policy without being pie in the sky about it.
Right.
And so I do like some of the articles we've done there in recent years. I've done most of the writing on foreign policy that we've been posting, and so you can just find my archive there and click on that. But I would encourage anyone who's interested in these issues, as well as issues related to like homicide and gun control, militias, and so on. These are all important issues around just how states are created, how people are kept safe, and so on. We do not assume that if you just get rid of government that everybody will be fine. Private security has a real role there, and these are difficult questions. We're just simply opposed to this idea that you can simply wave the government like a talisman in front of every problem, and that will solve it. But that's, of course, the problem most people have, is they've been so conditioned to think that every problem will be solved and they'll be kept safe by their government, not realizing, of course, that the record isn't nearly as good as they perhaps imagine it is, because, of course, most people know almost nothing about foreign policy.
Right, that's true.
Well, and it's hard to keep up.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I must admit that I am a financial supporter of the Mises Institute. I do contribute to them on a yearly basis or monthly basis or whatever I do. I lose track of all my contributions. I got to keep a list of them. And if it wasn't for the contributions that I made to these organizations, I probably wouldn't get a tax refund every year. But also, I want to thank you very much for being on our program. And I do wish that you would accept our invitation to return at a later date.
That sounds great. I'd be happy to do that.
All right, Ryan, thank you so much for being on our program. Good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support We'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, folks, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.